The first bullet struck the rock face 3 inches from Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood's head, sending chips of granite spinning into the twilight air. She dropped flat against the mountainside, her breath controlled, her mind already calculating angles and distances. The reconnaissance mission had been textbook perfect until 30 seconds ago, when the ridge came alive with muzzle flashes. 3 more rounds cracked overhead. Rhea pressed herself into a shallow depression in the stone, feeling the cold seep through her tactical gear. Her radio was dead, crushed when she had thrown herself down the initial slope. The extraction point lay 2 kilometers east, but between her and safety stood at least a dozen hostiles who had positioned themselves with the kind of precision that spoke of training and patience. She heard them calling to each other in sharp bursts, their voices carrying confidence. They thought they had her cornered. In the fading light, she watched their silhouettes moving along the ridge line, flanking positions being established with military efficiency. Rhea's fingers found the knife strapped to her thigh, a poor defense against automatic weapons. But her face remained calm as she assessed every shadow, every gap in their formation. The shooting stopped. A voice rang out across the rocky terrain, speaking accented English. "Come out now, and you will not be harmed." Rhea stayed perfectly still, her eyes tracking the speaker's position. She knew the lie in those words, knew what capture meant in hostile territory. But she also knew something they did not. Before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have heard stories of soldiers overcoming impossible odds in your area. Movement to her left. Rhea turned her head slowly, watching 3 figures descend from higher ground. They moved with the casual assurance of men who believe the outcome was already decided. Their leader, a tall man with sergeant's insignia barely visible in the dimming light, gestured to his companions. They spread out, weapons raised but not quite aimed, treating her like a trapped animal that had already accepted defeat. "You are alone," the sergeant called out. "Your team has abandoned you. Put down your weapon and stand up." Rhea's hand moved to her sidearm, but she made no move to draw it. Instead, she calculated trajectories, memorized faces, noted the way the sergeant favored his right leg slightly. Every detail mattered. Every observation was a weapon she could use later. The trap closed with professional precision. 6 soldiers surrounded her position within minutes, their rifles trained on her with unwavering discipline. Rhea stood slowly, her hands visible but not raised in surrender, her posture straight despite the circumstances. The sergeant approached, his expression mixing satisfaction with something close to disappointment. "An American woman," he said, studying her face. "You are far from home." He gestured sharply, and 2 soldiers moved forward to secure her. Rough hands pulled her arms behind her back, zip ties cutting into her wrists. They searched her with thorough efficiency, removing her sidearm, her knife, her equipment. She let them, her face betraying nothing, her mind cataloging every touch, every movement, every tactical mistake they made in their confidence. The sergeant leaned close, his breath hot against her face. "You have made a very bad mistake coming here." His smile held no warmth. "Commander Aldrich will be very interested to meet you." They marched her down the mountain as darkness gathered. 8 soldiers formed a loose perimeter around her, weapons ready, but their attention already drifting. They talked among themselves in their own language, occasionally laughing, the tension of the ambush fading into the routine of a successful capture. None of them noticed how carefully Rhea watched the terrain, how her eyes adjusted to the failing light with practiced ease, how her breathing remained steady despite the uncomfortable pace. The enemy camp emerged from the shadows like a temporary fortress, tents and equipment scattered across a cleared area at the base of the mountain. Generators hummed, and harsh electric lights cut through the natural darkness. Rhea noted every detail with the systematic precision of someone trained to escape from exactly this kind of situation. Guard positions, patrol patterns, blind spots where the artificial light failed to penetrate. A man emerged from the largest tent, his uniform marking him as an officer. Commander Victor Aldrich moved with the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority, his gray hair military short, his face weathered by years of mountain warfare. He stopped 3 paces from Rhea, studying her with cold analytical eyes. "The American woman soldier," he said, his English flawless. "Sergeant Vostok informs me you were conducting reconnaissance. Alone." He circled her slowly. "Either you are very foolish or your commanders think very little of your life." Rhea met his gaze steadily, saying nothing. Silence was its own form of resistance. Aldrich nodded to himself, as if her silence confirmed something. "Take her to the holding area. We will speak again when she understands her situation more clearly." He turned away dismissively. "Double the perimeter guards. I want no surprises tonight." They dragged her to a reinforced tent at the camp's edge, throwing her inside with casual violence. The space was bare except for a metal chair bolted to the ground and a single harsh bulb hanging from the ceiling. Sergeant Vostok secured her to the chair with additional restraints, checking each binding with professional thoroughness. "You will tell us everything," he said quietly. "Everyone does eventually." He left, and 2 guards took positions outside the tent flap. Rhea sat in the chair, her body still, her mind racing. Through the tent fabric, she could hear the camp settling into night routine. Voices faded. Generators throttled down. The harsh lights dimmed slightly as power was conserved. And in that gradual transition from artificial brightness to natural darkness, Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood felt the first stirring of something her captors could not see, could not understand, and would learn to fear too late. The night was coming, and the night had always been hers. Commander Aldrich returned when the camp had settled into the quiet rhythms of night watch. He entered the tent alone, carrying a metal folding chair that he placed deliberately across from Rhea. He sat with the careful precision of a man who had conducted hundreds of interrogations, his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Your name, rank, and unit," he said. It was not a question, but a formality, spoken with the weary patience of someone going through motions he knew were pointless. Rhea remained silent, her eyes fixed on a point just past his left shoulder. The restraints cut into her wrists, but her breathing stayed even controlled. She had been in this chair for 3 hours now, and her body had already begun the subtle work of testing the bindings, feeling for weaknesses her captors could not see. Aldrich smiled slightly. "You believe silence protects you." He leaned back in his chair. "Perhaps you think rescue is coming. Your team will return for you." He shook his head slowly. "But they will not come, Lieutenant. Your military does not trade lives for lives in hostile territory. You know this." He stood and walked to the tent entrance, pulling back the flap to reveal the camp beyond. Generators hummed their mechanical song. Guards moved between pools of light, their weapons slung casually over shoulders. Everything spoke of routine, of a force comfortable in its own territory. "We control this entire sector," Aldrich continued. "Your people abandoned this region 3 months ago. Whatever mission brought you here was already a failure before you set foot on that mountain." He let the flap drop, returning to his seat. "So you will tell me what I need to know. Not tonight, perhaps. Not tomorrow. But you will tell me." Rhea's eyes moved to his face then, studying him with the same careful attention she had given to the camp layout, the guard positions, the terrain. She saw confidence, certainly, but also something else, a slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed once against his knee before he caught himself. He was not as certain as he pretended to be. Aldrich noticed her scrutiny, and his expression hardened. "You think you see weakness." His voice dropped lower. "I have broken stronger soldiers than you. Men with years of combat experience. Special forces operatives who believe themselves invincible." He stood abruptly. "You're nothing special, Lieutenant. Just another American who wandered too far from home." He left without another word, the tent flap snapping shut behind him. Through the fabric, Rhea heard him speaking to the guards in sharp tones. "Double shifts tonight. No one enters without my direct authorization." The guards acknowledged with crisp efficiency. Alone again, Rhea allowed herself a slow breath, feeling the rhythm of the camp around her. Boots on gravel. Low conversations in the distance. The periodic crackle of radio communications. She cataloged every sound, building a mental map of the enemy's routine. Her training whispered through her mind in the voice of her first-year instructor, a grizzled master sergeant who had taught her that capture was not defeat, only a change in tactical position. Sergeant Vostok appeared near midnight, bringing a canteen of water. He held it to her lips without speaking, his expression unreadable in the harsh overhead light. Rhea drank slowly, controlling the impulse to gulp, maintaining discipline even in small things. When she finished, Vostok stepped back, studying her with something approaching curiosity. "You are very calm," he observed. "Most prisoners cry by now. Beg. Try to bargain." He tilted his head. "What makes you different, American woman?" Rhea met his gaze steadily, but offered no response. Silence was power, and she hoarded it like ammunition. Vostok grunted. "The commander thinks you are reconnaissance. Maybe intelligence officer." He circled behind her chair, and Rhea heard the soft whisper of a knife leaving its sheath. She forced her muscles to stay relaxed, showing no fear. The cold blade touched her neck, just below her ear, not cutting but present. He leaned close. "But I think you're nothing. Lost soldier playing at war games." The knife withdrew. Vostok moved back in her line of sight, sliding the blade back into its sheath. "We will see," he said quietly. "Night is long. Morning brings new questions." He left, taking the canteen with him. The hours crawled past. Rhea used the time as she had been trained, running through mental exercises that kept her mind sharp despite physical discomfort. She reviewed everything she had observed. Camp layout. Approximately 40 personnel, standard patrol rotation every 2 hours, command tent northwest corner, generator station southeast, vehicle depot on the access road. Guard positions, 2 at her tent, for on perimeter, 2 roaming patrols. Weaknesses, overconfidence, reliance on artificial lighting. Assumption that one captured woman posed no threat. Through the tent fabric, she watched shadows shift as guards changed position. The camp was settling deeper into night routine, lights dimming further as non-essential power was cut. She could hear the change in voices, the way conversations grew quieter, more sporadic. Fatigue was setting in among the guards, that dangerous time between midnight and dawn when attention wavered and vigilance faltered. A memory surfaced unbidden. Fort Bragg, 2 years ago, the final phase of her SEER certification. They had left her alone in a simulated prisoner holding area, restrained and isolated, while instructors monitored her psychological state. The lesson had been simple but profound. Restraints were temporary, darkness was an ally, and the enemy's assumptions were weapons that could be turned against them. Her fingers worked slowly against the zip ties, feeling the texture of the plastic, finding the microscopic ridge where manufacturing had left a slight weakness. Not enough to break free, not yet, but enough to know that freedom was possible given time and opportunity. Everything was possible given time and opportunity. Outside, a guard coughed. Radio static crackled. Someone laughed at a joke Rhea could not hear. The camp breathed around her like a living thing, unaware that within its supposedly secure perimeter sat someone who had been trained by the best military in the world to do exactly one thing when captured: survive, adapt, and escape. Dawn was still hours away, but Rhea felt no fear of the coming interrogation. Aldrich would ask his questions. Vostok would make his threats, and she would give them nothing while taking everything she needed. Information, time, opportunity. The night deepened outside her tent, and with it, Rhea Blackwood's resolve hardened into something cold and unbreakable. They thought they had captured a soldier. They had no idea what was really sitting in that chair, watching, waiting, and planning every move that would transform their victory into their greatest mistake. The guard changed at 0400 hours. Rhea tracked the rotation through sound alone, the tired shuffle of boots being replaced by the crisper steps of fresh sentries. She had counted 17 guard changes since capture, each one a data point in the pattern she was building. The new guards were always more alert for the first 30 minutes. then gradually settled into the comfortable routine of watching a secured prisoner who posed no apparent threat. Sergeant Vostok arrived with the dawn, bringing stale bread and water. He released one of her hands, watching carefully as she ate with mechanical efficiency. Her wrist bore deep impressions from the restraints, purple bruises blooming against pale skin, but she showed no sign of pain. When she finished, he secured her hand again, checking the bindings with professional thoroughness. "The commander will return soon," Vostok said, settling against the tent support. "He will not be as patient as yesterday." He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with a battered metal lighter. The smoke curled upward in the still morning air. "I have seen him work. Strong men break. What chance does one woman have?" Ria's mind drifted to another time, another place. The mountains of Colorado, SEER School Phase 3, where instructors had stripped away every comfort and forced students to confront their limits. She remembered the isolation cell, smaller than this tent, darker, colder. She remembered the psychological pressure, the simulated interrogations designed to crack even the most resilient minds. And she remembered her instructor's final words: "Your captors will always underestimate you because of what they see. Use that. Make it your weapon." Vostok stood abruptly, grinding his cigarette beneath his boot. "You should speak while you have a chance. The commander's patience has limits." He left without waiting for a response that would not come. Aldrich entered an hour later, accompanied by a younger officer Ria had not seen before. The new man carried a leather folder, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He set up a small field table and opened the folder with bureaucratic precision, revealing maps and reconnaissance photographs. "This is Captain Dmitry Kovac," Aldrich said, gesturing to his companion. "He specializes in intelligence analysis." The captain nodded curtly, his eyes cold and analytical. "Together, we will piece together why you were on that mountain, with or without your cooperation." Kovac spread the maps across the table, marking positions with a red pen. "Your infiltration point was here." He tapped the map. "You moved northwest for approximately 6 kilometers before we intercepted you." His finger traced her route with unnerving accuracy. "This trajectory suggests you were attempting to reach the communications relay station we established last month." Aldrich leaned forward. "Were you planning to sabotage our equipment? Gather signal intelligence? Or perhaps you were meeting someone, a local asset who has been feeding information to your forces?" The questions came in waves, methodical and relentless. Kovac would present evidence, real or fabricated, while Aldrich watched for reactions. They worked with practiced coordination, one analytical and precise, the other intimidating through sheer presence. But Ria had trained against exactly this technique, had spent hours in mock interrogations where instructors employed every psychological tool in the manual. She kept her face neutral, her breathing steady, her eyes unfocused on a point between them. The SEER training whispered its lessons. They need your reaction more than your words. Give them nothing. Not fear, not anger, not even defiance. Be stone, be water, be absent. Aldrich's frustration manifested in small ways. The tightening of his jaw, the sharper edge to his questions. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the packed earth floor. "You test my patience, Lieutenant." He circled behind her, his presence oppressive. "I can make this much more difficult for you. There are methods, techniques that leave no marks but break the will." Kovac gathered his papers with deliberate slowness. "Commander, perhaps we should let her consider her situation. Hunger, isolation, and time can be persuasive." Aldrich paused, then nodded curtly. "Very well. 3 days, Lieutenant. 3 days to decide if your silence is worth what comes after." He and Kovac left together, their voices fading as they crossed the camp. Alone again, Ria allowed herself a moment of careful movement, testing her restraints with renewed focus. The zip tie on her right wrist had loosened fractionally during the night, microscopic progress that her captors had not noticed. She worked her hands slowly, feeling the plastic give another fraction of a millimeter. Not enough to escape yet, but enough to know that escape was approaching possibility. Through the tent walls, She heard the camp coming fully alive. Morning formations, breakfast preparations, vehicles being serviced. The sounds painted a picture of routine, of an enemy comfortable and complacent. They had settled into the rhythm of holding a prisoner, their initial alertness fading into the mundane reality of guard duty and camp maintenance. A younger guard brought lunch, barely more than a boy despite his uniform. He set the food down nervously, avoiding eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the duty. Rhea studied him carefully, noting the way his hands shook slightly, the fresh patches on his uniform marking him as a recent recruit. Inexperience was another weapon she could use. The afternoon stretched long and quiet. Rhea used the solitude to run through escape scenarios in her mind, mapping routes through the camp based on everything she had observed. The vehicle depot offered the most obvious exit, but also the most heavily guarded. The northern perimeter bordered rocky terrain that would provide cover but required navigating in darkness through unfamiliar ground. The generator station was isolated, a potential vulnerability if she could create a distraction. Every scenario required one critical element: freedom from these restraints and access to darkness. Her captors controlled the light, thinking it gave them power. They did not understand that she had spent months training in conditions far worse than this, learning to navigate by sound and touch, becoming one with the darkness they feared. As evening approached, Vostok returned with water. He studied her with renewed interest, noting perhaps that despite hours of interrogation and isolation, she showed no signs of breaking. No tears, no pleading, no desperate attempts at bargaining. Just that same calm presence that seemed to unsettle him more than defiance would have. "You're not like other prisoners," he said quietly, almost to himself. "There is something different about you." Rhea met his eyes then, holding his gaze with the kind of steady confidence that came from absolute certainty in her training. For just a moment, she let him see past the facade of helpless captive, let him glimpse something harder and more dangerous. Then she looked away, returning to apparent passivity. Vostok left quickly, and Rhea heard him speaking urgently to the perimeter guards. "Increase vigilance. Do not underestimate this one." His instinct was warning him, but too late and with too little understanding of what he faced. Night fell over the camp like a familiar blanket, and with it came the subtle shift in Rhea's demeanor. The restraints were looser now, worked patiently through hours of microscopic movements. The guard rotation patterns were memorized. The camp layout was mapped in her mind with tactical precision. And most importantly, her captors had revealed their fatal flaw. They believed the cage made them safe from the predator within. The second night brought rain, a cold mountain storm that turned the camp into a maze of mud and darkness. Rhea listened to the downpour hammer against the tent fabric, calculating how the weather would affect guard positions, visibility, and her captor's alertness. Rain was an ally, masking sound and reducing the effective range of the camp's lighting. Aldrich did not return that night. Instead, Vostok conducted his own interrogation, less refined than the commander's approach, but no less determined. He paced the small tent space like a caged animal, his frustration evident in every sharp movement. 2 days you have been silent, he said, stopping directly in front of her. 2 days of wasting time. His hand moved to his sidearm, resting on the grip with casual menace. Perhaps you think it will not harm you, that your status as prisoner protects you. Rhea's breathing remained steady, her pulse controlled. She had learned long ago that fear was a choice, and she chose instead to focus on the details that mattered. Vostok's holster was military issue, standard retention system. The tent had 3 support poles, the central one slightly weaker than the others. The rain had created new sounds outside, changing the acoustic signature of the camp in ways her captors would not notice, but she could use. Vostok grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to meet his eyes. "You will break. Everyone breaks." He released her with a sharp push that snapped her head back. "The commander gives you 1 more day. After that, I convince you my way." He stormed out into the rain, shouting orders at the guards. Rhea heard increased activity outside, boots splashing through puddles, voices raised over the storm. They were changing patrol patterns, adding security measures. Vostok's instinct was still warning him, even if he could not articulate the specific threat. The young guard from earlier brought evening rations, his uniform soaked through. Water dripped from his helmet as he set down the tray, his hands moving with the clumsy uncertainty of exhaustion. He glanced at Rhea, then away, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. "How old are you?" Rhea asked quietly, speaking for the first time since capture. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, designed to sound conversational rather than manipulative. The guard froze, clearly shocked to hear her speak. He looked toward the tent entrance nervously. 19, he said finally, his voice barely audible over the rain. "First deployment," Rhea observed, making it a statement rather than a question. "You volunteered or were conscripted?" The guard's eyes widened. "How did you—" He stopped himself, stepping back. "I'm not supposed to talk to you." His accent was thick, his English practiced, but unpracticed in actual conversation. Rhea nodded slightly, as if accepting his boundary. "What is your name?" The guard hesitated, then seemed to decide there was no harm in answering. "Private Alexei Petrov." He straightened slightly, as if using his name gave him back some authority. "And you should eat. The commander will ask questions tomorrow." Petrov left quickly, but Rhea had gained something valuable. A name, a connection, and the confirmation that at least one guard was young enough to still question orders, still human enough to be uncomfortable with the dehumanization of prisoners. That humanity was another tool in her arsenal. The storm intensified through the night, wind whipping the tent fabric with violent intensity. Rhea used the noise to work her restraints more aggressively, the sound of the storm masking any small creaks or movements. The zip tie on her right wrist had stretched significantly now, the plastic fatigue from constant pressure. Another few hours, and she would have enough play to slip her hand free. She closed her eyes and let her training take over, running through the mental exercises that had been drilled into her through countless hours of preparation. SEER instructors had taught her that escape was 90% mental preparation and 10% physical execution. The body could only do what the mind had already accomplished in simulation. In her mind, she walked through the camp layout, from her tent to the perimeter, 40 meters northeast, crossing 2 patrol paths. The generator station, 60 meters south, isolated but within sight of the command tent. The vehicle depot, 80 meters west, most heavily guarded, but offering the best chance of rapid evacuation. Each route had advantages and risks that shifted based on weather, time, and the enemy's alertness level. The rain began to ease near midnight, settling into a steady drizzle. Rhea heard the guard change, recognized the voices of the night shift. These guard were more experienced, their movements efficient and professional. They would be harder to evade, but fatigue would still work in her favor. Even the best soldiers grew weary during the deepest hours of night. Vostok made a late inspection, checking each guard post personally. Rhea heard him speaking to Petrov in harsh tones, likely reprimanding the young private for speaking to the prisoner. The exchange ended with Petrov's subdued acknowledgement and Vostok's footsteps splashing away through the mud. Through the pre-dawn hours, Rhea continued her patient work. The restraint gave another millimeter, then another. Her wrist ached from the constant pressure, bruised and raw, but pain was irrelevant. Pain was just information, and she had learned to file it away as unimportant compared to the objective. A memory surfaced from her final SEER evaluation. The instructors had restrained her with military-grade flex cuffs and placed her in a stressed position for hours. They had told her that escape was impossible, that resistance was futile, that cooperation was her only option. She had smiled at them through the discomfort and said nothing, then proceeded to free herself in under 3 hours using nothing but patience and technique. The lead instructor had recommended her for advanced training the next day. Dawn came slowly, the rain-scrubbed sky turning from black to gray. Rhea heard the camp stirring, morning routines beginning despite the mud and damp. Generators coughed to life, their familiar hum slightly different in the wet air. Voices called out breakfast formations, equipment checks, the mundane machinery of military life. Petrov brought morning rations, his face carefully neutral. He avoided eye contact as he set down the food, clearly having been disciplined for the previous night's conversation. But as he turned to leave, he glanced back once, and Rhea saw something in his expression. Not quite sympathy, but recognition of shared humanity. It was enough. The right restraint was ready now, loose enough that she could slip her hand free with sustained effort. But timing mattered more than capability. Freedom meant nothing if she freed herself at the wrong moment, in the wrong conditions, without the proper opportunities aligned. She needed darkness, distraction, and a clear understanding of the guard positions. Aldrich returned mid-morning, his uniform immaculate despite the mud outside. He carried himself with renewed determination, his jaw set in the hard line of someone who had made a decision. He stood before her, hands clasped behind his back, studying her with cold calculation. "You're silent since today," he said flatly. "I have been patient, but patience has its limits." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Tonight, Lieutenant, we will see how strong your resolve truly is. Captain Kovac has prepared more persuasive methods than simple conversation." He left without waiting for a response, and Rhea understood that her timeline had accelerated. Whatever Aldrich and Kovac were planning would happen after dark, which meant her escape had to happen before then. Tonight would be the night she transformed from captured prisoner to something her enemies could not anticipate, could not prepare for, and ultimately could not stop. The afternoon crawled past with agonizing slowness. Rhea forced herself to remain still, conserving energy while her mind rehearsed every movement she would need to make. The camp had settled into its post-storm routine, soldiers cleaning equipment and fortifying positions that the rain had compromised. Through the tent fabric, she tracked their movements by sound alone, building an updated tactical picture of enemy positions. Kovac arrived at 1500 hours carrying a metal case that clinked ominously as he set it on the field table. He opened it with methodical precision, revealing an array of instruments designed for one purpose. Aldrich stood by the tent entrance, his expression unreadable in the harsh afternoon light filtering through the canvas. "I will give you one final opportunity," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of false reasonableness. "Tell us your mission parameters, your chain of command, your intelligence objectives. Cooperate, and this becomes unnecessary." He gestured toward the case. Rhea's eyes moved from the instruments to Aldrich's face, then to Kovac's careful preparations. She said nothing, her silence now a familiar shield between her and their questions. But inside, her awareness sharpened to crystal clarity. The timeline had collapsed even further. Whatever happened next would determine whether she escaped or endured something far worse. Kovac approached with a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This is a simple truth serum," he explained in his clinical tone. "Sodium pentothal mixed with other compounds. Very effective, very reliable." He held it up to the light, checking for air bubbles with professional detachment. "Within minutes, you will tell us everything willingly." The needle approached her arm. Rhea's hand tensed against the restraint, feeling the loosened zip tie stretch another fraction. Not yet. Timing was everything. The injection site was her left arm, away from the weakened restraint. Kovac's focus was entirely on the procedure, his guard dropped in the confidence of having a secured prisoner. The needle pierced her skin. Cold liquid entered her vein. Kovac stepped back, checking his watch with bureaucratic precision. "We will wait 10 minutes for full effect." Rhea felt the drug spreading through her system, but years of resistance training had prepared her for this moment too. SEER instructors had administered various substances during training, teaching students to recognize effects and maintain core awareness even under chemical influence. The key was not to fight the drug, but to ride it, to maintain the essential self beneath the pharmaceutical haze. Her vision began to soften at the edges. Her thoughts took on a dreamlike quality. But underneath, her training held firm, a bedrock of discipline that the drug could not fully erode. When Kovac began asking questions, her responses came slow and slurred, but still under her control. Name, rank, serial number, nothing more. The words every soldier was trained to repeat under any circumstance. Aldrich's frustration manifested in a sharp curse. Increase the dosage. Kovac hesitated. Commander, that could be dangerous. The recommended limit. Do it, Aldrich snapped. The second injection came, and with it, a deeper fog. Rhea felt her grip on consciousness weakening, but she focused on the one thing that mattered. Her right hand, working slowly against the restraint. The drug had relaxed her muscles, making the tight space feel larger. Her hand slipped backward, millimeter by careful millimeter, while Kovac asked his endless questions and received only mumbled repetitions of name, rank, and number. Aldrich slammed his hand on the table. This is useless. He turned to Kovac. How long until she can be moved? Several hours, Commander. The drug needs to metabolize. Moving her prematurely could cause complications. Then we continue tonight, Aldrich said. Prepare the enhanced interrogation protocols. He stormed from the tent, leaving Kovac to pack his instruments with meticulous care. Kovac paused at the tent entrance, looking back at Rhea with something almost resembling regret. I am sorry, Lieutenant. This is not personal, just necessary. Then he too was gone, leaving her alone with the two guards outside and the fog slowly beginning to lift from her mind. The drug's effects peaked and then gradually receded. Rhea used the recovery time to continue working her hand, the chemical relaxation actually aiding her efforts. The zip tie stretched further, the plastic now fatigued to the breaking point. Her hand was slick with sweat and blood from abrasions, making the passage easier despite the pain. Evening approached. The camp lights flickered on, harsh artificial illumination that her captors believed made them safe. Rhea's hand slipped another inch backward. She could feel her knuckles compressing, bones grinding together, but the angle was right now. One more sustained effort, and she would be free. Petrov brought dinner, his young face troubled. He set down the tray and glanced nervously at the tent entrance. They are preparing something for tonight, he whispered. I do not know what, but the commander ordered the medical tent prepared. He met her eyes briefly. I'm sorry. Before he could leave, Rhea spoke, her voice still slightly slurred from the drugs. Petrov, when they come for me tonight, stay away from this tent. Do you understand? The private's eyes widened. I do not. He shook his head and fled, leaving Rhea alone with her warning and her nearly completed preparations. Full darkness fell. The camp settled into night routine, but with a difference. More guards patrolled the perimeter. Voices carried tension that had not been present before. Aldrich was preparing for his enhanced interrogation, mobilizing resources, ensuring that tonight would finally break his resistant prisoner. Rhea waited until 2200 hours, when the guard change created its brief window of transition. Then, with one sustained pull that sent white fire through her compressed hand, she slipped free of the right restraint. Her hand emerged bloody and swollen, but functional. She held perfectly still, listening to the guards outside, ensuring they had not heard the faint pop of plastic giving way. The left hand was easier now, with one hand free to manipulate the restraint from a better angle. Within 3 minutes, both hands were loose. The ankle restraints followed quickly, her fingers working with practiced efficiency despite the numbness and pain. Free of the chair, Rhea remained seated, allowing her circulation to return and her muscles to remember their purpose. She rolled her shoulders slowly, flexed her fingers, tested her balance. The drug still lingered in her system, but adrenaline was burning it away, sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. Through the tent fabric, she could see the shadows of her two guards standing close together, talking in low voices. Beyond them, the camp spread out in its familiar pattern, pools of light connected by shadows. The generator station hummed to her left. The vehicle depot sat dark and distant to her right. And directly ahead, past the perimeter, lay the mountain darkness that would transform her from prey to predator. Rhea moved to the tent's back corner, her hands finding the seam in the canvas. Seer training had taught her a dozen ways to breach a tent silently, using nothing but patience and technique. She began working the stitching with careful pressure, separating threads one by one, creating an opening just large enough for her body to slip through. The camp around her continued its routine, unaware that the prisoner in the secured tent had just become something far more dangerous. The night was here, deep and welcoming, and Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood was finally ready to show her captors what darkness truly meant to someone who had been trained to own it. The opening in the tent canvas widened slowly, thread by thread. Rhea worked with infinite patience, her fingers remembering every lesson from escape and evasion training. Rush meant noise, and noise meant discovery. She had all the time in the world as long as her guards remained unaware. Through the growing gap, cold night air touched her face. She could see the back of the camp now, the area between her tent and the perimeter where shadows pooled thick between scattered equipment. A supply truck sat 30 meters away, its bulk creating a dark corridor that led toward the northeastern fence line. The guards at her tent entrance shifted position, their boots scraping against gravel. One of them laughed at something his companion said, the sound carrying clearly in the still air. They were relaxed, confident, completely unaware that their prisoner was no longer restrained. Rhea widened the opening until it was large enough for her body. She paused, listening to the entire camp's rhythm. 2 patrol teams were visible, their flashlight beams sweeping predictable patterns. The command tent glowed with interior light, Aldrich's silhouette visible through the canvas as he consulted with Kovac. The generator station hummed its mechanical song, steady and reliable. She slipped through the opening like water, her body trained to move with absolute silence. The moment her boots touched the ground outside, she froze, becoming part of the shadow, letting the darkness embrace her. This was her element now, the environment where all her specialized training came alive. The supply truck was her first objective. She moved toward it in a crouch glide, weight distributed evenly, each footfall placed with surgical precision. Seer instructors had made her practice this movement for hundreds of hours, teaching her body to become invisible through motion rather than stillness. Predators moved. Prey froze. She was learning to be the predator. Behind the truck, Rhea allowed herself a moment to assess. Her hands were damaged from the restraints, her system still processing the interrogation drugs, but her mind was crystalline clear. The escape route lay ahead, but she needed supplies. Water at minimum. Anything else would be a bonus. A equipment locker sat against the truck's rear wheel. She tested the latch, finding it secured but not locked. Inside, she found a treasure: canteens, energy bars, a folding knife, and most importantly, a compact tactical flashlight with a red filter. She took only what she could carry silently, leaving no evidence of disturbance. Voices approached. 2 soldiers walking a perimeter check, their conversation casual. Rhea melted back into the truck's shadow, controlling her breathing, becoming nothing more than another piece of camp equipment. The soldiers passed within 3 meters, so close she could smell their cigarette smoke, but their eyes never turned toward the darkness where she waited. When they had moved on, she continued toward the perimeter. The fence line was chain-link topped with concertina wire, industrial rather than military grade, installed quickly rather than well. She had identified the weak point 2 days ago from inside her tent, a section where the fence met rocky terrain and the posts sat in shallow soil. Getting to that section required crossing an open area illuminated by a pole-mounted light. Rhea studied the light's position, calculating angles. The bulb created a cone of visibility, but shadows existed even in direct light for those who understood geometry and the human eye's limitations. She moved to the edge of the illuminated zone and stopped. The patrol team's flashlight beams swept left. Rhea counted their rhythm, memorizing the pattern. Sweep left, pause 3 seconds, sweep right, pause 2 seconds, begin again. The pause on the right sweep was her window. She waited for the next cycle. Left sweep, 3 seconds. Right sweep began. Rhea moved during the pause, crossing the open ground in a low sprint that covered 8 meters in under 2 seconds. She hit the far shadow and froze, becoming stone again. No alarm. No shouts. The patrol continued its mechanical routine, unaware that their prisoner had just crossed the camp's most exposed section. The weak fence post stood directly ahead now. Rhea approached it carefully, testing the ground around the base. The recent rain had softened the soil further, and the post shifted when she applied pressure. Perfect. She used the folding knife to dig around the post base, working quickly but quietly. The soil came away in clumps, exposing the shallow foundation. Within minutes, she had loosened it enough to create a gap at ground level, a space where the fence could be lifted. A radio crackled nearby. Rhea froze mid-motion, her hand still gripping the fence. A guard was responding to a routine check-in, his voice bored and automatic. All clear Sector 3. She remained motionless until his footsteps faded, then resumed her work. The gap widened. She tested it with her hands, confirming she could slip through without catching on the wire. Beyond the fence, the mountain terrain rose in dark silhouettes against the slightly lighter sky. Cover, concealment, freedom. But leaving was only the first phase. Surviving the pursuit that would inevitably follow was the true test. Rhea took a moment to orient herself, identifying landmarks she had memorized from inside her tent. The rock formation to the northeast, the tree line 1 kilometer distant, the ravine system that would mask her thermal signature from any aerial surveillance. She squeezed through the gap, feeling the fence scrape against her back. Then she was outside the perimeter. Free. But freedom was an illusion until she put distance between herself and her former captors. She low-crawled away from the fence for 50 meters, using the terrain's natural folds, then rose to a crouch and began moving with purpose. Behind her, the camp continued its routine. Guard changes, radio checks, Aldrich and Kovac preparing their interrogation protocols for a prisoner who was no longer there. Rhea allowed herself a cold smile at the thought of their faces when they discovered the empty tent. She navigated by starlight and memory, moving northeast toward the higher ground. Every 100 meters, she paused to listen, ensuring no pursuit had begun. The camp remained quiet, its lights a distant glow that diminished with each minute of travel. At the base of a rocky outcrop, Rhea finally stopped to assess her situation. She had escaped the immediate perimeter. She had supplies, limited but adequate. She had darkness, her greatest ally. And most importantly, she had training that her captors could not match. The night air was cold against her face, but she felt no chill. Adrenaline and purpose kept her warm. She drank from one of the canteens, rationing the water carefully, then studied the terrain ahead. The ravine system beckoned, a network of natural channels that would confuse any tracking attempts. A sound drifted from the distant camp, faint but distinctive. A shout, then another. They had discovered her absence. The alarm was spreading through the camp like fire through dry grass. Within minutes, search teams would deploy, flashlights would sweep the perimeter, and Aldrich would realize that his prisoner had been far more dangerous than he had imagined. Rhea moved into the ravine system, descending into darkness so complete that even starlight failed to penetrate. Here, in this absolute black, she was no longer the hunted. She had become something else entirely, something her training had prepared her to be. The tables had turned, and the night that her captors feared had become her hunting ground. She disappeared into the shadows like smoke, leaving behind only questions and the growing realization among her former captors that they had made a terrible, perhaps fatal, mistake in underestimating the woman they thought they had captured. The ravine swallowed Rhea completely, its walls rising 15 feet on either side, blocking even the faint starlight. She navigated by touch and sound, one hand trailing along the rock face, her feet finding purchase on the uneven ground with practiced certainty. This was the environment where her specialized training transformed from theory into survival. Behind her, the camp had erupted into chaos. Searchlights swept the perimeter in frantic patterns. Voices shouted commands in overlapping confusion. Vehicle engines roared to life, their headlights stabbing into the darkness like desperate fingers. Aldrich had discovered his prize was gone, and the realization was spreading through his forces like panic. Rhea moved deeper into the ravine system, choosing paths that led upward toward the higher terrain. Every decision was calculated. The ravine would mask her thermal signature from any aerial surveillance, but it also limited her escape routes. She needed to use the terrain strategically, staying hidden long enough to gain distance, then breaking for the tree line, where tracking would become nearly impossible. A helicopter's distant thump reached her ears. They were mobilizing air assets, the sound growing louder as the aircraft swept search patterns over the surrounding area. Rhea pressed herself against the ravine wall, remaining motionless as the helicopter passed overhead. Its searchlight carved through the darkness above, but the ravine's depth protected her from detection. The aircraft moved on, its search pattern systematic but predictable. Military training produced consistency, and consistency created patterns that could be exploited. Rhea memorized the helicopter's timing, noting the 45-second intervals between passes. That was her window for movement. She waited for the next pass, then climbed rapidly up the ravine's side using natural handholds in the rock. Her damaged hands protested, fingers struggling for grip, but pain was irrelevant compared to the objective. She reached a ledge that offered a vantage point over the camp and paused to assess the enemy's response. The camp below blazed with activity. Every light was on, turning the once secure position into a beacon of desperation. She counted 6 vehicles deployed, their headlights sweeping the immediate perimeter. Soldiers formed search lines, moving outward in expanding circles. Aldrich's silhouette was visible near the command tent, gesturing violently as he organized the hunt. But they were searching in the wrong places. Their lights swept the flat approaches, the obvious escape routes, the paths that made tactical sense to soldiers trained in conventional warfare. None of them understood that Rhea had been trained to think differently, to use terrain that others dismissed as impassable, to embrace the darkness they tried to banish with artificial light. The helicopter returned on schedule. Rhea remained frozen on her ledge, becoming part of the rock face, invisible through absolute stillness. The searchlight swept past, and she continued her climb. At the ravine's upper edge, she emerged onto a rocky plateau that stretched toward the distant tree line. The open ground was her next challenge, 500 meters of exposed terrain with minimal cover. But exposure worked both ways. The search teams below were silhouetted against their own lights, their positions betrayed by the very illumination they thought kept them safe. Rhea studied the helicopter's pattern one more time, then began her crossing during the longest interval between passes. She moved in a low run, using scattered boulders as waypoints, pausing behind each one to ensure no pursuit had spotted her. Her shadow merged with the rock shadows, her dark clothing rendering her nearly invisible against the mountainside. Halfway across, voices erupted from the ravine behind her. A search team had found her entry point, their flashlights bobbing as they descended into the channel she had used. They were following her trail, but they were too slow, too loud, and too dependent on their lights. By the time they reached her ledge, she would be gone. The tree line rose ahead, a dark wall of pines that promised concealment and complex terrain. Rhea covered the final 200 meters in a sustained sprint, her lungs burning, her legs remembering the endless conditioning that SEER training had demanded. She hit the trees at full speed and immediately changed direction, angling north instead of continuing east. Inside the forest, the darkness was complete but not hostile. Rhea's eyes had fully adjusted now, her night vision operating at peak efficiency. She could distinguish between shadows, identify obstacles, navigate through the undergrowth with minimal noise. The trees were allies, their canopy blocking the helicopter's searchlight, their density defeating thermal imaging. She ran for 10 minutes before stopping to listen. The sounds of pursuit were distant now, confused, scattered across too much terrain. Radio chatter echoed through the forest as search teams tried to coordinate, but their voices carried frustration. They had lost their trail, and the mountain size was defeating their numbers. A stream cut through the forest ahead, its water black and swift. Rhea waded into it without hesitation, using the current to mask her scent and thermal signature. She followed the stream uphill for half a kilometer, the cold water numbing her legs but eliminating the trail that dogs or thermal equipment might follow. When she finally emerged from the stream, she was 3 kilometers from the camp and moving in a terrain that grew increasingly hostile to her pursuers. The higher elevations offered rock fields and cliff faces that would challenge even experienced climbers. For Rhea, trained in mountain warfare and extreme survival, they were highways to freedom. She paused on a rocky outcrop to check her supplies. The canteens were intact, the energy bars dry, the knife ready. Her hands were worse now, the cold water having opened the abrasions, but they still functioned. Everything she needed to survive was either in her small pack or in her head, the accumulated knowledge of years of specialized training. The helicopter sound had faded to barely audible, its search pattern having moved to the wrong sector. Below, vehicle lights crawled along distant roads, trying to establish a perimeter that was already too small. Aldrich had made another critical mistake, assuming his prisoner would flee directly away from the camp, rather than using the terrain to move in unexpected directions. Rhea checked her bearings using the stars. The nearest Allied position was 40 kilometers northwest, across some of the most challenging mountain terrain in the region. It would take her 3 days of hard travel, moving only at night, staying ahead of the inevitable expanded search. But 3 days was nothing compared to what she had already endured. She allowed herself 1 energy bar and a careful drink of water, rationing her supplies for the journey ahead. Then she began moving again, climbing higher into the mountains, putting vertical distance between herself and the search teams below. The night deepened around her, and with it came a profound sense of transformation. She was no longer Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood, captured reconnaissance specialist. She was no longer a prisoner enduring interrogation. She had become something her training had always promised she could be: invisible, unstoppable, and absolutely in control of her own fate. Behind her, Aldrich's forces continued their fruitless search, their lights growing dimmer with distance, their voices fading into the mountain silence. They were hunting a ghost, chasing shadows, pursuing someone who had already won by understanding something they never could. The darkness was not her enemy. It never had been. It was her weapon, her shield, and her domain. And in that domain, she was undefeatable. Dawn threatened the eastern horizon with the first hint of gray when Rhea found the cave. It was barely more than a deep cleft in the rock face, hidden behind a fallen boulder and accessible only by a narrow ledge. Perfect. She squeezed inside and assessed her shelter with professional detachment. Dry, defensible, invisible from both ground and air. She would rest here through the daylight hours while her pursuers exhausted themselves searching in the wrong places. She rationed another energy bar and half a canteen of water, forcing herself to eat slowly despite her body's desperate hunger. Discipline had kept her alive this far, and discipline would carry her the remaining distance to safety. Her hands needed attention, the abrasions from the restraints now infected and swollen. She cleaned them as best she could with stream water and strips torn from her undershirt, improvising bandages that would at least keep dirt from the wounds. Sleep was impossible despite her exhaustion. Her mind remained locked in tactical mode, constantly analyzing threats and planning contingencies. She used the forced rest to review her situation with brutal honesty. 3 days to friendly lines, limited supplies, injured hands, an enemy force that now understood they had underestimated her and would be hunting with renewed determination. But she also had advantages, training that none of her pursuers could match, terrain knowledge built from careful observation during her captivity, and most importantly, the psychological edge that came from turning the tables. Aldrich's forces were demoralized, their confidence shaken by losing a supposedly secured prisoner. That doubt would make them hesitant, and hesitation was fatal in mountain warfare. Through the cave entrance, she watched the day brighten. The helicopter returned with the light, its search pattern more systematic now. It flew grid patterns over the forest, occasionally hovering when the crew spotted something worth investigating. But each time it moved on, finding nothing. Rhea had left no trail they could follow, no sign they could interpret. Voices carried up from the valley below. A search team was working its way through the forest, calling to each other as they swept the undergrowth. Rhea listened to their progress, noting the frustration in their shouts. They were tired, cold, and increasingly convinced they were chasing nothing. She heard one soldier argue with his sergeant about abandoning the search. The sergeant's response was sharp but lacked conviction. Midday brought unexpected activity. Vehicle engines echoed through the valley, multiple trucks moving with purpose. Rhea crawled to the cave entrance and studied the distant road. A convoy was departing the camp, heading east. She counted 8 vehicles, which meant Aldrich was pulling significant forces from a search. Either he was reinforcing his perimeter further out, or he was giving up on the immediate area. By afternoon, the helicopter's search pattern had shifted 3 kilometers south. The forest below fell quiet as search teams were recalled or reassigned. Rhea used the lull to plan her night's movement. She would continue northwest, staying in the high country where the terrain was too difficult for vehicle pursuit and too vast for foot patrols to cover effectively. She studied the mountain range visible from her cave. The route ahead offered both promise and peril. A high pass would cut directly toward Allied lines, but would leave her exposed on open ridges. The valley route was safer from observation, but added half a day to her journey and risked running into enemy patrols on the better ground. The decision crystallized as the sun began its descent. High route. Speed mattered more than caution now. Every hour she delayed gave Aldrich time to expand his search radius, to bring in reinforcements, to establish the perimeter that would trap her. She needed to move fast and hard, accepting the exposure risk in exchange for distance. As twilight gathered, Rhea prepared for movement. She inventoried her remaining supplies: 1 full canteen, 2 energy bars, the folding knife, the tactical flashlight she had not yet needed to use. Minimal, but adequate if she maintained discipline. She stretched carefully, working stiffness from muscles that had been still all day, testing her injured hands against the rock face to ensure they could still grip. Full darkness brought renewed confidence. This was her time, her element. Rhea emerged from the cave and began climbing toward the high pass, using the stars to navigate. The route was brutal, a near-vertical ascent over loose scree and exposed rock faces. Her hands screamed protest with every handhold, but she pushed through the pain, focusing on the rhythm of movement. Reach, grip, pull, step. Reach, grip, pull, step. 3 hours of climbing brought her to a ridge line that stretched toward the pass. The wind hit her with physical force, cold and relentless, but the ridge offered speed. She could move along its spine at nearly a run, the solid rock providing sure footing even in darkness. Below, scattered lights marked enemy positions. The camp she had escaped glowed in the distance, smaller now, with perspective. Other lights dotted the valley, patrol bases or checkpoints Aldrich had established. But the pattern revealed the gap in his coverage, the sector where his forces were thinnest. That was her path. The helicopter returned near midnight, its searchlight sweeping the lower elevations. But Rhea was above its search zone now, moving through altitude where the aircraft would struggle with the thin air. She watched it circle futilely below, then continue its patrol further south. At 0200 hours, she reached the pass. The saddle between peaks offered a view of both the territory behind and the terrain ahead. Behind, Aldrich's search zone was a constellation of lights and movement, desperate activity that revealed organization breaking down into chaos. Ahead, the mountains rolled away into darkness, empty and wild, leading toward the Allied positions that meant safety. Rhea allowed herself a moment to rest at the pass, sheltered from the wind behind a boulder. She was 12 kilometers from the camp now, moving faster than any pursuit could match. Her supplies were holding. Her body was functioning despite the abuse. And most importantly, her training continued to prove its worth. A sound carried on the wind from below. Dogs barking. Aldrich had deployed tracking teams, but too late and in the wrong location. By the time they reached her previous position, she would be another 5 kilometers ahead, moving through terrain where even the best tracking dogs would lose the scent. She descended the pass's far side, dropping into a valley system that angled northwest. The gradient was gentler here, allowing faster movement through the darkness. She made good time, covering ground with the efficient stride of someone who understood how to maintain pace across distance. Dawn would find her 20 kilometers from her starting point, well outside the initial search radius. Aldrich would be receiving reports of failure, his forces scattered across too much terrain, his prisoner transformed into a ghost story that would haunt his career. And with each hour of darkness, with each kilometer gained, Rhea moved closer to the moment when she would emerge from the mountains and prove beyond doubt that underestimating her had been Aldrich's greatest mistake. The night was hers, the mountains were hers, and freedom was measured now not in hope, but in calculated distance covered under stars that had witnessed her transformation from captured soldier to something far more dangerous. The second night pushed Rhea's endurance to its limits. The high altitude thinned the air, making each breath a conscious effort. Her body was running on reserves now, fueled by determination and the last energy bar she allowed herself at midnight. The canteens were nearly empty despite careful rationing. She needed to find water soon or risk becoming too weak to continue. A stream revealed itself by sound before sight, its gurgling music carrying through the darkness. Rhea approached cautiously, checking for signs of human presence before kneeling at the water's edge. She drank deeply, then refilled both canteens, adding purification tablets from the small emergency kit she had found in the equipment locker. The cold water shocked her system back to alertness. Movement downstream caught her attention. Flashlight beams, 3 of them, sweeping through the forest maybe half a kilometer away. A patrol had pushed further into the search zone than she expected. Rhea melted back into the shadows, watching their approach with professional interest. The patrol consisted of 4 soldiers, moving with the careful tension of men operating in hostile territory. They were taking the search seriously now, working as a coordinated unit rather than the scattered individuals she had observed earlier. Aldrich had reorganized his forces, concentrating them in the most likely escape corridor. He was learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous. Rhea counted their weapons, noted their equipment, assessed their skill level. These were not the inexperienced conscripts who had guarded her tent. These were professional soldiers, probably Aldrich's best team, deployed to the sector where intelligence suggested their escaped prisoner might be traveling. The patrol passed within 50 meters of her position, their lights sweeping methodically. Rhea remained absolutely still, controlling even her breathing, becoming nothing more than another shadow among many. One soldier paused, turning his head as if sensing something, but his companion called to him, and they continued their sweep. When they had moved on, Rhea changed her route. If Aldrich had committed his best team to this sector, he was predicting her path with uncomfortable accuracy. She needed to do something unexpected to break the pattern he was anticipating. Instead of continuing northwest along the logical route, she angled north, accepting rougher terrain in exchange for security. The detour cost her time and energy, forcing her to navigate through a boulder field in near total darkness. Each step required careful testing, her feet finding purchase on unstable rock, her damaged hands gripping surfaces that threatened to shift beneath her weight. But the difficulty was also protection. No patrol would follow this route, and any tracking attempt would lose her trail in the jumbled stone. 3 hours before dawn, she emerged from the boulder field onto a ridge that offered a panoramic view of the search zone. What she saw both encouraged and concerned her. The concentration of lights had shifted, moving south and east, away from her actual position. Aldrich's best guess had been close, but not quite correct. Her detour had taken her outside his predicted corridor. But the sheer scale of the search was sobering. Dozens of lights moved through the valleys, a coordinated sweep that suggested significant reinforcements had arrived. Helicopters sat idle at the distant camp, probably waiting for dawn to resume air operations. And along the roads, regular vehicle patrols maintained a loose perimeter that was gradually tightening. Rhea studied the pattern, calculating windows and weaknesses. The perimeter was strongest to the south and east, lighter to the north where the terrain became extremely difficult. That was her path, through the worst ground, where vehicles could not follow and foot patrols would struggle to maintain formation. She descended the ridge's north face, entering a landscape of vertical cliff bands and narrow canyons. This was technical terrain, requiring climbing skills that most soldiers did not possess. Her SEER training included advanced mountaineering, hundreds of hours spent on rock faces learning to trust her body and technique. Now that training became the key to her escape. A particularly challenging section forced her to free climb a 40-foot cliff face in darkness. Her fingers finding holds by touch alone, her feet trusting tiny ledges that she could not see. The exposure was terrifying, a single mistake meaning a fatal fall, but fear was just another sensation to be acknowledged and set aside. She climbed with mechanical precision, each move calculated, until she pulled herself over the top and lay gasping on solid ground. The effort had cost her. Her hands were bleeding again, the bandages soaked through. Her shoulders trembled with fatigue, but she had gained altitude and distance, putting herself in terrain where pursuit became nearly impossible. Dawn found her in a high alpine meadow, a hidden pocket of relatively flat ground surrounded by peaks. She found shelter under an overhanging rock and collapsed into it, her body demanding rest that she could no longer deny. She allowed herself 2 hours of fitful sleep, her mind still partially alert for sounds of danger. When she woke, the sun was well up and the helicopter was back, its distinctive sound carrying clearly in the thin air. But it was searching valleys to the south, its pattern suggesting the ground teams had lost her trail completely. Aldrich was expanding his search radius, which meant he no longer had any clear idea where she was. Rhea used the daylight to treat her hands more thoroughly, cleaning the wounds with water and wrapping them with the last of her makeshift bandages. The infection was spreading, her palms hot and swollen, but she still had mobility. Pain management became a mental exercise, compartmentalizing the sensation, refusing to let it influence her decision-making. Her remaining supplies were critically low. Half a canteen of water, no food, the knife and flashlight. She calculated her remaining journey. 15 kilometers to the Allied forward operating base she had identified during mission planning. One more night of hard travel, maybe 2 if she had a detour around unexpected obstacles. The helicopter's search pattern shifted again near midday, moving further east. Rio watched it through squinted eyes, tracking its path until it disappeared behind a peak. The sound faded completely, replaced by the high mountain silence that was broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a bird. She waited until the sun began its descent, using the time to rest and plan. The final push would be tonight. She would move through darkness one more time, covering the remaining distance to safety. Her body was failing, her supplies exhausted, but her will remained unbroken. 3 days ago, she had been a prisoner. Now, she was hours from freedom. As twilight gathered, Rhea emerged from her shelter and began the final phase of her escape. The terrain ahead was treacherous but navigable. The enemy was scattered and searching in the wrong places. And the night, her constant ally, was returning to embrace her one last time. She moved with renewed purpose despite her fatigue, each step taking her closer to the moment when she would walk into Allied lines and prove beyond any doubt that Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood was far more than Aldrich had ever imagined. The darkness deepened around her, and she disappeared into it like she belonged there, because after 3 days of using it as weapon and shield, she did. The final night began with Rhea discovering she was not alone on the mountain. Fresh boot prints marked the trail ahead, multiple sets moving in tactical formation. An enemy patrol had pushed this far north, either by luck or by Aldrich's increasingly desperate calculations. She studied the tracks in the failing light, reading the story they told. 6 soldiers, heavily equipped, moving northwest, directly along her intended route. She had 2 choices: wait for them to pass and risk losing precious hours, or find a way around them through even more difficult terrain. Rhea chose a third option. She would follow them, staying close enough to monitor their position but far enough back to remain undetected. When they stopped for the night, she would slip past while they slept. The tracking was delicate work. She moved ghost-like behind the patrol, using every shadow and terrain feature to remain invisible. When they paused to check their position, she froze. When they continued, she followed. The technique was called shadowing, taught in advanced seer training, designed for escaped prisoners who needed to monitor their pursuers without engagement. 2 hours after dark, the patrol stopped in a sheltered valley to establish a temporary position. Rhea watched from a ridge above as they set their perimeter, posted guards, and settled in. They were professional, their discipline evident in how they secured their location. But discipline created patterns, and patterns could be exploited. She counted the guard rotation. 2 sentries, for sleeping, rotating every 2 hours. The gap between sentry positions was approximately 30 meters, covered by overlapping fields of observation. But overlapping fields created a blind spot, a narrow corridor where the geometry of sight lines failed. Rhea identified it within minutes. A small ravine that ran along the camp's western edge, hidden by a slight rise in the terrain. At midnight, during the guard change when attention was divided, she made her move. She descended from the ridge using the ravine as concealment, her movements controlled to absolute silence. The sleeping soldiers were 10 meters to her right, the sentries 20 meters to her left. She was in the heart of their position, invisible because she understood darkness in ways they never could. A branch cracked under someone's boot. One of the sentries, shifting position. Rhea froze mid-step, her body locked in perfect stillness. The sentry's flashlight swept in her general direction, the beam passing within 2 meters of her position. But she was in shadow, her dark clothing and absolute immobility rendering her effectively invisible. The light moved on. She continued through the camp's perimeter, taking 15 minutes to cover 30 meters. When she finally cleared their position and regained safe distance, her heart rate remained steady, her breathing controlled. Fear was just chemistry, and she had learned to master her body's reactions. Past the patrol, the terrain opened into a series of rolling hills that descended toward lower elevations. Rhea recognized the landmark from her mission briefing. The Allied Forward Operating Base lay 10 kilometers northwest, tucked into a valley system that provided natural defense. She had made it. Barring disaster, she would reach friendly lines before dawn. But disaster found her anyway. The helicopter appeared without warning, its running lights off, using terrain-following radar to navigate in darkness. Advanced hunting techniques that Aldrich had held in reserve for exactly this moment. The aircraft swept low over the hills, its thermal imaging scanning for heat signatures that did not belong. Rhea had seconds to react. She threw herself into a depression in the ground, pulling loose vegetation over her body, pressing herself flat against the cold earth. The helicopter passed directly overhead, so close she could feel the rotor wash, then circled back for a second pass. The crew had detected something, not quite enough for confirmation, but enough to warrant investigation. The aircraft hovered 200 meters away, its searchlight suddenly blazing to life, sweeping the area in systematic patterns. Rhea remained absolutely still, breathing shallowly through her nose, her face pressed into the dirt. The searchlight swept over her position once, twice, 3 times. Each time, Her improvised camouflage and absolute stillness defeated the visual search. But the thermal imaging was another problem. Even pressed against cold ground, her body heat would eventually register as an anomaly. She had maybe 2 minutes before the crew's analysis identified her as a human-sized heat source. The helicopter's attention shifted suddenly. Voices crackled over its external speakers, commands in the enemy's language. Then it banked hard and accelerated south, moving with purpose toward some new priority. Something had drawn it away, some other contact or urgent message that superseded the suspicious thermal reading. Ria waited a full 5 minutes before moving, ensuring the aircraft was truly gone. When she finally rose, her body was stiff with cold and tension, but relief flooded through her. That had been too close, the narrowest margin between escape and recapture. She moved faster now, accepting increased noise in exchange for speed. The helicopter's presence meant Aldrich was deploying his most sophisticated assets, which meant time mattered more than stealth. She ran when the terrain allowed, maintaining a ground-eating pace that burned through her remaining energy reserves. The land began to change. Signs of friendly presence appeared: old fighting positions, abandoned equipment caches, trail markers that meant nothing to the enemy, but everything to someone trained to read them. She was entering the buffer zone between opposing forces, the contested ground that belonged to neither side, but was patrolled by both. At 0300 hours, Ria topped a rise and saw lights in the valley below. Not the scattered, searching lights of enemy patrols, but the organized illumination of a military base. Guard towers, perimeter fencing, vehicle parks, the Allied forward operating base, exactly where intelligence had placed it. She studied the base's perimeter defenses from a safe distance, identifying the guard positions and patrol patterns. Walking up to a forward base in darkness was an excellent way to get shot by nervous sentries. She needed to announce herself properly, following the protocols for friendly approach in a combat zone. A patrol emerged from the base, for soldiers moving along the perimeter road. Ria waited until they were at the furthest point of their route, then activated her tactical flashlight for the first time since escape. She aimed it at the guard tower and flashed the recognition signal she had memorized during mission briefing. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short. The tower's spotlight swung toward her position immediately, pinning her in harsh white light. She stood slowly, hands raised and visible, the flashlight held loosely in her right hand, continuing the recognition pattern. A voice boomed from the tower's loudspeaker, demanding identification. "Lieutenant Ria Blackwood," she shouted back. "Service number 7739245. I am an escaped prisoner requesting immediate extraction and debriefing." The spotlight held her for long seconds while the tower crew verified her identity through whatever systems they had available. Then the voice returned, different now, urgent and alert. "Hold position, Lieutenant. Quick reaction force deploying to your location. Do not approach the perimeter." Ria lowered her hands slowly, keeping them visible, and waited. Within 2 minutes, an armored vehicle emerged from the base, moving at speed toward her position. Behind it came another vehicle, then another. The base had gone to full alert, response teams deploying to secure a returning prisoner who should have been dead or worse. The lead vehicle stopped 20 meters away, and soldiers emerged with weapons ready but not aimed. An officer approached cautiously, studying her in the vehicle's headlights. She saw his expression change as he processed what he was seeing. A woman in torn, filthy clothing, hands wrapped in bloody bandages, face gaunt with exhaustion and dehydration, but standing upright, alert, and very much alive. "Lieutenant Blackwood," the officer said, his voice mixing relief with professional concern. "Welcome home." The medical tent smelled of antiseptic and strong coffee. Ria sat on an examination table while a medic worked on her hands with gentle efficiency, cleaning wounds that had become badly infected during her escape. And 4 drip-fed fluids and antibiotics in her system, fighting the dehydration and infection that had pushed her body to its breaking point. Captain Sarah Hendricks stood nearby, taking notes on a tablet, while conducting the initial debriefing. She was intelligence core, sharp-eyed and methodical, but her professional demeanor could not quite hide her amazement at the story unfolding before her. "You were held for 3 days," Hendricks said, reviewing her notes. "Interrogated multiple times. Administered chemical agents. And you still managed to escape, evade a full-scale search operation, and cover 40 kilometers of hostile mountain terrain." She looked up from her tablet. "That is exceptional, Lieutenant." Rhea accepted the assessment with a slight nod, too tired for false modesty. "I did what I was trained to do. The SEER program prepared me for exactly this situation." The base commander arrived as the medic finished bandaging Rhea's hands. Colonel Marcus Webb was career infantry, his uniform bearing the patches of multiple combat deployments. He studied Rhea with the calculating gaze of someone who understood what her successful escape represented. "Lieutenant Blackwood," he said, pulling up a chair to sit at her level rather than standing over her. "I need to understand what intelligence value you might have gathered during your captivity. The enemy position, strength, capabilities. Anything that might help us." Rhea's exhausted mind shifted into operational mode, calling up the details she had cataloged during her imprisonment. Commander Victor Aldrich commands approximately 40 personnel at a forward camp positioned at grid coordinates she recited from memory. He has vehicle support, helicopter assets, and recently received reinforcements. His security was overconfident, his interrogation methods conventional, his tracking capabilities limited by reliance on technology over fieldcraft. Webb leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "Did you observe their communication setup, supply routes, command structure?" For the next hour, Rhea provided a detailed intelligence dump, describing everything she had observed about enemy operations. The layout of Aldrich's camp, the patrol patterns, the vehicle types and capabilities, the quality of his troops, ranging from experienced professionals to poorly trained conscripts. Every detail was a piece of the larger puzzle that intelligence analysts would use to understand enemy capabilities. When she finished, Webb sat back with visible satisfaction. "This is valuable intelligence, Lieutenant. Very valuable. Your successful escape is remarkable, but the information you brought back might be even more important." He stood, extending his hand. "On behalf of the command, thank you. You exemplified everything we expect from our soldiers." After Webb left, Hendricks continued the debriefing with questions about Aldrich's psychological profile, his decision-making patterns, anything that might predict his future actions. Rhea answered methodically, but fatigue was finally overwhelming her adrenaline reserves. "We will continue this after you have rested," Hendricks said, recognizing the signs. "But I need to ask one more thing. How did you do it? How did you maintain the discipline to escape and evade when most prisoners would have broken?" Rhea considered the question carefully before answering. "Training gave me the tools, but the mindset was simpler than that. I refused to accept their definition of the situation. They saw a prisoner. I saw someone temporarily detained who would leave when the opportunity presented itself." She met Hendricks' eyes. "Never let the enemy define who you are or what you can do." Hendricks nodded slowly, making a note. That philosophy should be taught to every soldier. She closed her tablet. "Get some rest, Lieutenant. You have earned it." They gave Rhea a private tent with a real bed, the first she had experienced in days. But sleep came in fragments, her body struggling to accept that she was finally safe. Every sound triggered alertness. Every shadow suggested threat. The psychological cost of her ordeal was beginning to manifest now that the immediate danger had passed. Morning brought news. The base intelligence section had processed her information and cross-referenced it with other sources. Aldrich's camp had been identified for a potential operation. Her escape had not only saved her own life, but had provided the intelligence necessary for command to consider offensive action. Major David Torres from Special Operations visited mid-morning, his uniform bearing the insignia of a direct action unit. He studied Rhea with the professional interest of someone who recognized exceptional capability when he saw it. "I reviewed your service record," he said without preamble. "SEER instructor qualified, advanced mountain warfare, night operations specialist, Your escape demonstrated every one of those skills under extreme pressure. He paused. When you recover, I would like to discuss opportunities with my unit. We need operators who can perform at your level. Rhea accepted the implied compliment with quiet acknowledgement. I would be interested in that conversation, Major. Torres left her his contact information and a word of advice. What you did these past 3 days will become legendary. The story is already spreading through the base. Use it. Let it remind everyone what proper training and proper mindset can accomplish. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Private Alexei Petrov, the young guard who had spoken with her during captivity, had been captured during a border patrol that morning. He was in the detention facility awaiting processing, but he had asked specifically about the American woman who had escaped. Hendricks arranged a brief meeting, curious about the connection. Petrov sat across from Rhea in an interview room, his young face showing relief mixed with apprehension. "You made it," he said simply. "I am glad." Rhea studied him, seeing the same uncertainty and fundamental decency she had recognized during her imprisonment. "You treated me with respect when others did not. I remember that." Petrov looked down at his hands. "I did not want to be part of what they were doing. When you escaped, I was glad, even though it meant trouble for me." The brief conversation revealed much about the complexity of the enemy forces. Not everyone wearing the uniform believed in the cause. Some, like Petrov, were conscripts caught in circumstances beyond their control. The information was valuable for intelligence purposes, but it also reinforced something Rhea had learned during her ordeal. Humanity existed even in enemy ranks, and recognizing it was part of being a complete soldier. That evening, Webb called her to the command tent for a formal recognition ceremony. The entire base staff assembled as he presented her with a commendation for exceptional performance under extreme circumstances. The words were formal, military in their precision, but the respect behind them was genuine. Lieutenant Blackwood demonstrated the highest standards of military discipline. Webb read from a citation. Through expert application of survival skills, tactical thinking, and unwavering determination, she successfully escaped enemy captivity and returned with intelligence of significant value. Her actions reflect great credit upon herself and the military service. The assembled soldiers applauded, and Rhea saw in their faces something that made the ordeal worthwhile. She had become proof that the training worked, that the impossible could be accomplished, that one soldier with the right skills and mindset could overcome overwhelming odds. As the ceremony concluded and soldiers returned to their duties, Rhea stood outside the command tent watching the sun set over the mountain she had crossed. 3 days ago, she had been a prisoner. Now she was free, validated, and recognized. But more than that, she had proven something to herself. The darkness she had embraced during her escape was not just a tactical environment. It was a metaphor for facing the unknown with confidence born from preparation and will. 2 weeks after her escape, Rhea stood in the briefing room watching intelligence officers present their analysis to senior command. Her hands had healed, the infections cleared by aggressive antibiotic treatment. The physical scars would remain, permanent reminders of restraints and rock faces, but they were badges she wore with quiet pride. The intelligence major gestured to satellite imagery displayed on screen. Based on Lieutenant Blackwood's detailed intelligence, we identified critical vulnerabilities in the enemy's forward operating structure. Commander Aldrich's position has been under continuous surveillance since her escape. He paused, advancing to the next image. 3 days ago, his camp was abandoned. Signal intercepts suggest he was recalled and faces disciplinary action for the security failure. Webb glanced at Rhea with approval. "Your escape did more than save your own life, Lieutenant. It disrupted their entire forward intelligence operation and damaged their confidence in that sector." After the briefing, Rhea walked the base perimeter, following the same route the patrol had taken the night she arrived. Soldiers nodded respectfully as she passed, word having spread about the lieutenant who had turned 3 days of captivity into a masterclass in survival and evasion. Some asked questions about her training, seeking advice for their own preparation. She answered each one patiently, sharing lessons learned not with bravado, but with the practical directness of someone who had tested theory against reality. Major Torres found her near the vehicle depot, his timing clearly intentional rather than coincidental. "I have authorization to make a formal offer," he said. "My unit needs a SEER instructor with operational experience. Someone who can teach from a position of demonstrated capability rather than just curriculum." Rhea considered the opportunity. Teaching had always been part of her career plan, but she had imagined it coming later, after more field experience. Torres seemed to read her thoughts. "What you accomplish provides more credibility than a dozen conventional deployments," he continued. "Soldiers need to see proof that the training works under real pressure. You're that proof." The offer was compelling, not for career advancement, but for the opportunity to ensure other soldiers had the same preparation that had saved her life. She extended her hand. "I accept, Major. When do I start?" Torres smiled. "After you complete your recovery leave. Command insists you take 30 days before any new assignment. Use it to process what happened, spend time with family. Remember why we do this work." The mention of family stirred emotions Rhea had carefully compartmentalized during her ordeal. Her parents would have been notified she was missing, then that she had been recovered. The thought of their worry, their relief, made her realize how much she needed that leave time. The following week brought an unexpected communication. A letter had arrived through official channels, forwarded from international oversight observers. The handwriting was young, uncertain, but the English serviceable. It was from Petrov. "Lieutenant Blackwood," the letter began. "I write to thank you for speaking on my behalf during processing. Your statement that I showed decency helped my case. I am returning home to my family rather than facing harsher consequences. I wanted you to know that your example affected me deeply. You showed that strength and honor can exist even in terrible circumstances. I will remember this always." Rhea folded the letter carefully, recognizing it as closure for a part of her ordeal she had not realized needed resolving. Enemy soldiers were still people, and reaching one person's humanity across the lines of conflict mattered in ways that transcended military objectives. Her final day at the forward base brought a surprise formation. Webb assembled the entire command for what he called a community recognition event. But when Rhea was called forward, she realized the true purpose. "Lieutenant Blackwood," Webb said formally, "your successful escape and evasion operation has been recognized at the highest levels of command. But beyond the official commendations, your actions have inspired this entire base. You've demonstrated that proper training, mental discipline, and unwavering determination can overcome what appears impossible." He gestured to the assembled soldiers. "Everyone here has been affected by your example. You have reminded us all why we train hard, why we push ourselves beyond comfort, and why we never surrender to circumstances." The soldiers erupted in applause, genuine and sustained. Rhea felt the weight of their respect, understanding that her ordeal had transcended personal survival to become something larger. She had become a symbol of what was possible when training met necessity. After the formation, younger soldiers approached with questions that went beyond technical skills. "How did you stay mentally strong? How did you maintain hope? How did you know you would make it?" Rhea answered each question honestly. "I did not know I would make it, but I knew I would try with everything I had." Hope was not about certainty. It was about refusing to accept defeat while any option remained. And mental strength came from preparation. The training gave me tools. The mindset made me willing to use them. If you enjoyed the story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or moment from Rhea's journey. Or share if you have ever witnessed someone reveal unexpected strength when it mattered most. Your thoughts and experiences help us understand what resonates with you. The transport that would begin her journey home arrived at dawn. Rhea loaded her gear, taking a final look at the mountains she had crossed during the darkest period of her life. Those peaks had witnessed her transformation from prisoner to survivor, from victim to victor. They had tested every skill she possessed and revealed depths of capability she had not fully understood until pressed her absolute limits. Webb walked her to the vehicle, his handshake firm and respectful. What you did out there matters, Lieutenant. Not just for intelligence value or tactical lessons. You proved something fundamental about the human spirit when properly prepared and properly motivated. Rhea settled into the transport, watching the base disappear behind her as they began the journey toward the rear areas and eventually home. Her hands bore scars that would never fully fade. Her mind carried memories that would require processing, but she also carried something else. The absolute certainty that she had faced the worst circumstances her profession could offer and had emerged not broken, but strengthened. The mountains receded into the distance, and with them, the chapter of her life that had transformed her understanding of herself. She had been captured, interrogated, and pushed to her limits. But the night that Aldrich and his forces had feared became the weapon she used to reclaim her freedom. The darkness had not defeated her. Instead, she had made it hers, turning their advantage into their undoing. Lieutenant Rhea Blackwood settled back in her seat, closing her eyes not in exhaustion, but in reflection. Somewhere behind her, Aldrich was facing consequences for underestimating his prisoner. Somewhere ahead, soldiers would train harder, knowing her story proved the training worked. And inside herself, she carried the knowledge that when everything else was stripped away, her skills, her will, and her refusal to surrender had been enough. The night had been her hunting ground, and she had hunted her way home.